Good to go? Good to go, yep. I declare open this public hearing of the Select Committee on Nuclear Energy for the inquiry into nuclear power generation in Australia. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land in which we meet today and pay my respects to our elders past, present and emerging. This hearing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcript of the proceedings will be published on the committee's webpage. I now welcome Mr Whitaker and Mr Buongiorno to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Perhaps I can go first. Jacopo Buongiorno. I'm a professor of nuclear science and engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Andrew Whitaker. I'm a SUNY Distinguished Professor of Civil Engineering at the University of Buffalo.
Thank you. This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Witnesses giving evidence from overseas should be aware that, whilst they are entitled to these protections of parliamentary privilege in Australia, with respect to the evidence they give, these protections may not extend to another country. Before I invite you to make a brief opening statement, then we proceed to discussion, would you please state that if you're a current or former member of a political party or a union or an investor in the renewable or nuclear industries?
Jacopo Buongiorno here. I'm not.
Andrew Whitaker. I'm not a member of a political party. I vote a certain way, but I have no standing in any political party.
No worries, thank you. I now invite you to both make a brief opening statement before we proceed to questions.
Okay, I think I'll start. Can you hear me and see me loud and clear?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. So good morning again. My name is Jacopo Buongiorno. I'm a professor of nuclear engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT. I'm also a member of the United States National Academy of Engineering, the director of MIT's Center for Advanced Nuclear Energy Systems. In my 30-plus years long career in nuclear engineering, I've published over 100 technical journal articles, advised dozens of students, worked on virtually every advanced nuclear reactor design currently under consideration for commercial deployment. I consulted for the nuclear industry and the United States government on matters related to nuclear safety and economics, and led MIT's 2018 influential study on the future of nuclear energy in a carbon-constrained world. Among other activities, I currently run a short executive education course on nuclear technology for marine propulsion, which is sponsored by the Australian Submarine Agency, or ASA, which has been taken by some 40-plus managers within Australia's Department of Defence and the ASA, including the Director General of the ASA, Royal Australian Navy Admiral Jonathan Meade. I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts on nuclear energy with you today. To that end, I prepare a few slides that I assume have been shared with you before this public hearing and will serve as support material for the following remarks. Let me clear the air up front. Nuclear is currently neither the cheapest nor the fastest energy source to deploy. However, when integrated in a balanced mix with renewables and storage, nuclear actually reduces the average cost of electricity to consumers. This is primarily because nuclear reactors generate carbon-free electricity 24/7, 365 days per year with no intermittency. If only intermittent energy sources such as wind and solar and the energy storage that goes with them are used to deeply decarbonize the power grid, then an enormous overcapacity of solar panels, wind turbines, electric batteries, and transmission lines must be built to meet electricity demand throughout every hour of the day and every day of the year. Set aside all considerations about the reliability of a 100% renewable grid or the environmental impact and land consumption associated with the deployment of hundreds of gigawatts of solar panels, wind turbines, and transmission lines, the sheer aggregate cost of such grid far exceeds the cost of one in which 20 to 30% of electricity is generated by nuclear reactors, even though the cost of a megawatt hour generated by nuclear is not necessarily the lowest at any given time. In other words, including a little bit of nuclear in the mix drastically reduces the amount of renewables, energy storage, and transmission capacity needed to run a reliable and decarbonized grid. In addition, nuclear is a very versatile and compact energy source. Not only can it be used to decarbonize and stabilize the national power grid at reasonable cost, it can also provide heat and electricity to co-located facilities, such as remote mining sites and military bases, as well as factories, chemical plants, desalination plants, and data centers, to mention a few. In that sense, nuclear reactors can be regarded as the Swiss knife equivalent of the energy world. I will now move on to the subject of the nuclear reactor technologies that could be considered for Australia. In my community, unfortunately, we have a special talent for confusing people. You might have heard of small modular reactors, microreactors, light water reactors, molten salt reactors, AP1000, BWX300, etc., etc. How to make sense of this jungle of designs and obscure acronyms? Well, in my opinion, the simplest way to group these nuclear technologies is by their power output and physical size. Therefore, we can distinguish between large reactors, which generate 1,000 megawatts of electricity or more, small modular reactors, or SMRs, which generate between 100 and a few hundred megawatts, and lastly, microreactors generating only a few megawatts. Within each category, there are various designs that use different coolants with different fuel forms and enrichment levels and operating at different temperatures, hence the acronym SOUP. State-of-the-art large reactors with a proven record of operation are available from suppliers in the United States, for example, AP1000 by Westinghouse, and South Korea, for example, APR 1400 by KHNP. And while their construction entails a large upfront investment, they're expected to deliver baseload carbon-free electricity at competitive cost, order of $100 per megawatt hour or less, especially when built as a series of multiple units. As far as the smaller size reactors are concerned, there are many companies in North America, Europe, and Asia hard at work to develop these designs, demonstrate their safety, and push them through the lengthy licensing process on the road to commercialization. Completion of the first-of-a-kind projects for several such designs in the US and Canada is anticipated by 2030 or early 2030s. These first-of-a-kind projects will not be cheap and may again experience some cost overruns and schedule delays. However, subsequent projects will benefit from lessons learned in the first-of-a-kind projects. The implication is that Australia should be able to get access to these technologies by the mid-2030s with relatively low financial and technical risk. Whether one chooses large, small, or micro-reactors, the lead times for licensing and procurement are usually quite long, so the time for action is now. In conclusion, I do believe nuclear energy can be of benefit to Australia as it seeks to decarbonize its energy systems reliably, affordably, and with minimal disruption to the environment. Therefore, I recommend that the Australian government and industry engage seriously with nuclear partner countries such as the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, France, and South Korea to explore if and what nuclear technologies would make sense for your country. Thank you for listening. I look forward to answering any questions you may have on these topics.
Thank you, Professor Buongiorno. Professor Whitaker?
Thank you. And again, good morning from Buffalo, New York. My name is Andrew Whitaker. I'm a SUNY Distinguished Professor of Civil Engineering at the University of Buffalo. I was born and raised in Melbourne, and I completed my undergraduate degree in civil engineering at the University of Melbourne in 1977. I then practiced in Melbourne for nearly 7 years before moving to the United States in late 1984 for graduate study in civil and earthquake engineering at the University of California, Berkeley. I've been a licensed civil and structural engineer in California since the late 1980s. Like Jacopo, I greatly appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts on nuclear energy with you this morning. So a focus of my research, professional service and consulting in the past 15 years has been the deployment of commercially viable nuclear energy. I've served as the chair of the ASCE Nuclear Standards Committee since 2015, and as such am responsible for the civil structures standards used for the seismic analysis and design of safety-related nuclear facilities. I've consulted for numerous advanced reactor designers and US government agencies on subjects related to the deployment of nuclear energy facilities. As Jacopo noted, nuclear power plants are not cheap to build, but they do provide 24/7 firm electricity for many decades, out to 80 years. Importantly, they can be co-located with industry off-takers of firm energy, such as steel mills and data centres, thus reducing or eliminating the need for new high-voltage transmission. Importantly, nuclear power plants can also be used to repower fossil generation assets such as coal plants, and in doing so, support and grow communities in country Australia. So, two questions often asked about nuclear power plants are, what is the cost and how long to build? Well, the cost and time are a function of how many units are to be built on the same site using the same construction workforce and supply chains. Assuming an average overnight construction cost of $8 billion for 1 gigawatt scale reactor, between 50% and 60% of the cost is related to civil structures, which will be spent in the Australian construction industry, spanning skilled tradies through PhD graduated scientists and engineers. Jobs in Australia for all Australians, which in my opinion is an investment and not a cost. Likely less than 20% of the overnight construction cost will be spent on systems purchased abroad. The time required to build a plant with 2 gigawatt scale reactors should be between 5 and 10 years total, taking advantage of the lessons learned from the recent construction in the United States of 2 AP1000 units at Plant Vogel and in the United Arab Emirates of 4 APR 1400 units at the Baraka nuclear energy plant. The time to construct Unit 1 at Baraka was 8 years. The construction of 4 identical units at the Baraka site took less than 12 years. Importantly, the time between the UAE deciding to pursue nuclear energy and connecting Unit 1 to the grid was 12 years, and they had no nuclear infrastructure or regulator on day one. Australia could do much better than 12 years because it has a nuclear regulator and an operating research reactor. Nuclear power plants are the most robust of all civilian infrastructure, designed to resist the effects of extreme natural hazards such as earthquake shaking, windborne missiles, hurricanes and tornadoes, flooding and bushfires. Because of the recent chatter in the Australian press regarding earthquakes and nuclear power plants, please let me make 3 points. First, nuclear power plants are built and operated in regions of high seismic hazard, such as coastal California and Japan. Second, the seismic hazard in Australia is low because the mainland is far from the boundaries of the Indo-Australian tectonic plate. Third, processes and procedures to characterise the effects of earthquake shaking on mission-critical infrastructure are both mature and mandated in the United States and elsewhere. To first build nuclear power plants in Australia, industry and academic experts from the US and elsewhere, including Australia, should be engaged for the seismic hazard characterisation following guidance set forth by the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission. This work should take 12 to 18 months. So in closing, I firmly believe that nuclear power should be part of the energy mix in Australia. Energy security is national security. Just as Australia is part of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance to protect its national security interests, the Australian government and industry should partner with allied countries, including the United States, United Kingdom and Canada, and France, South Korea and Japan to secure its energy future. Being part of a global nuclear supply chain, from fuel to equipment to engineering services, would benefit all Australians and enable Australia to play its important role in achieving climate targets. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. And now we'll go on to discussions. And we'll start off with Mr. O'Brien, the Deputy Chair today.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just say thank you to both of you very much and want to recognise your expertise. And I know we've got the time zones, I believe, in order for both of you. So thank you very much. Maybe Professor John Buongiorno, maybe starting with you. If you think of Australia's role, understanding you've had Australians in your own courses and are familiar, therefore, with what we're doing with the AUKUS deal, and you'd also understand our reserves of uranium and so forth. How well do you think Australia is positioned comparatively to other nations which might be looking at introducing civil nuclear power stations for the first time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Andrew already touched upon this in his introductory remarks. if you look at the most recent example of a nuclear newcomer country, the United Arab Emirates, and how successful their program to go from essentially zero experience, zero expertise in nuclear to what now amounts to 20-25% of their electric grid being nuclear in 12 years. I think Australia starts on a much, much stronger note than the Emirates. For the reasons that Andrew already mentioned, there is a capable regulator. It would have to be, of course, expanded beyond what it does now in Australia. But also, importantly, it has had expertise for over several decades in operating a research reactor over at Lucas Heights near Sydney for the purpose of producing radionuclides. So there is a modicum of nuclear expertise in Australia, which will only get stronger because of the AUKUS program. And what I've observed in my now almost 2 years interactions with the ASA is they fully understand that for AUKUS to be successful in Australia, there has to be a critical mass, no pun intended, of expertise and capabilities, primarily workforce, people that will have to be trained. And one of the perks of having a civilian nuclear industry that we have observed here in the United States, and it's the same in places like the UK and France, is that it creates a natural outlet for folks that start their career in the military, in this case in the Navy, in the nuclear Navy, to then find jobs once they're done in the civilian sector. And so there are strong synergies there between the the AUKUS program and the civilian program. Should you decide to go down that road? So I'm cautiously optimistic now. I know Australia from a distance, of course, and so you guys know better. But it seems to me that the starting position is pretty strong. Over.
And in your opinion, why don't we? I'll go to a different area actually. As you may or may not know. Sorry
to interrupt. I forgot to mention capabilities already exist in the front end of the fuel cycle that you mentioned, by the way, and I forgot to sort of remark that Australia is already a major player in the production of the extraction and commercialization of uranium, and so again, that's an additional obvious strength that can be leveraged for a domestic nuclear energy program. Sorry for the interruption. No,
thank you. The current government in Australia, their approach to energy for the electricity grid is to build a grid powered predominantly, almost entirely, by solar and wind technology as the primary energy sources. What we are looking at through this inquiry is the alternate government's approach, which is a balanced energy mix, which continues to see renewables and, with storage, of course, and gas, but the inclusion of nuclear energy. My questions here are, have you seen other nations successfully decarbonise an electricity grid predominantly with wind and solar while keeping energy prices down and maintaining system reliability? And what would be the advantages, do you think, of including nuclear energy as part of a balanced mix?
Well, I'll start by mentioning that the only examples that we have of a nearly fully decarbonized grid worldwide are in Europe. There are 4 or 5 countries that are well below a carbon intensity of 100 grams per kilowatt hour electricity generated in Europe, and they are Norway, France, Switzerland, Sweden, and Belgium. And if you look at their energy mix, it is essentially a combination of nuclear and hydro, and of course in recent years also a growing share of solar and wind. But the key elements going back 20, 30 years ago when these programs were launched were hydro and nuclear. Of course, back then the goal was not to decarbonize, was to create a system that would rely less on fossil fuels. But the bottom line is that they decarbonize. So the empirical evidence points to nuclear and hydro working together, working rather well. Having said that, we need to recognize that in the past 30 years, we've seen the cost of renewables coming down very handsomely, and those capabilities have to be leveraged. But as I tried to explain in my introductory remarks, 100% renewables, or frankly 100% nuclear grid would not be the least cost option, and it would not be the most reliable option. It's really a mix that leverages the low marginal cost of renewables when they are producing, and the reliability and, of course, low carbon nature of nuclear as a base load. And let me state it again very clearly. The role of nuclear is not that it has the lowest cost megawatt hour, kilowatt hour produced. It's that by keeping nuclear in the mix, it allows you not to have to build or overbuild the capacity of solar, wind, storage, and transmission lines that go with a fully renewable, 100% renewable grid. And so in the end, it helps bring down the average cost. Now, back to your question very briefly. Are there any countries that are 100% renewable? To my knowledge, no major industrial countries are 100% renewable. There are, of course, two regions, or one country and one state in the United States that have tried very hard to go the 100% renewable approach. The country that I'm referring to is obviously Germany, and as you know, they have failed miserably, both in terms of reliability as well as reducing their emissions. As a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they had to cut off gas, which is relatively low carbon intensity, and go back to coal. So the German example, honestly, has been an unmitigated disaster. A little bit better in California, but even in California, where they tried, and they're still trying very hard to go with solar and wind, they have to import stable electricity from neighboring states, which produce it with coal or natural gas. And wisely, this past couple of years, they've decided to extend the lifetime of their nuclear power plant because they recognize the role that nuclear can play. Again, I'm not going to repeat what their role is because I said it already a couple of times. So I think, again, the evidence points to a well-balanced mix, an all-of-the-above approach to be the best approach. Over.
Thank you, Professor. Professor.
Final question, Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you, Professor Whitaker. I note in one of your slides you mentioned about nuclear power plants being the most rugged of all civilian infrastructure. I wonder if you could explain how those power plants are designed to ensure they are seismically safe structures, and also speak to what would happen in the event of different sized earthquakes to civil infrastructure, comparing different infrastructure to that of a nuclear power plant.
Well, that's an interesting question to unpack. So I'll tackle it bit by bit, but I wanted to perhaps just add one comment to what Jacopo just said, namely, if I look at a country close by to us that has made a decision to include nuclear in its energy mix going forward, and that's the province of Ontario in Canada. So they understand the importance of a mix of energy sources, and they have made commitments to solar, wind, nuclear, and hydro. And so they have a basket of energy sources. And to Jacopo's point, if you were to talk with now the CEO of Ontario Power Generation, she would tell you that the mix leads to the cheapest solution for Canada, in her case, the province of Ontario. So the experience in Ontario is something Australia should pay attention to. Back to your question, Mr. O'Brien, about nuclear structures being rugged. Well, we characterise the effects of earthquake shaking on buildings, bridges and infrastructure in terms of ground acceleration, and the longer your time horizon, the greater the ground acceleration. For current generation nuclear power plants, we look at ground shaking that has a return period of between 50,000 years and 100,000 years, so 10 times the age of the pyramids. If we look at commercial buildings, it's 2,500 years. But an important difference here is that we design our nuclear structures to remain undamaged, by and large, operational after a major event, whereas we accept, in Australia too, significant damage to the built environment in the event of shaking that has a return period that's between 1/20th and 1/40th of what we would consider for the design of a large light water reactor. Put differently, if the shaking was sufficient at a site to damage a large light water reactor, all construction, all engineered construction in the vicinity of the plant would be destroyed. And so the only thing left standing would be the nuclear facility. So I think that's an important point to note.
Thank you, Mr.
So does that sufficiently answer your question?
Are you familiar with the Hunter zone here in Australia, Hunter Valley? In terms of the recent shaking here in Australia, do you think that poses a risk if there were a modern nuclear power plant?
No. Well, bluntly put, no. When I was asked by colleagues in Australia about the shaking in the Hunter, the shaking was insignificant. And if you lived in coastal California, as I did for a long time, you'd get that level of shaking once every day or two. So the level of shaking in the Hunter was small. But importantly, when you design infrastructure, you would, and a nuclear power plant in particular, you would undertake what we call a probabilistic seismic hazard assessment, and you would assess the expected levels of earthquake shaking as a function of what we call return period. So it would just be part of the design of the power plant. So it's routine. We've been doing it in the United States and elsewhere in the world, dating back to the 1970s. So the processes and procedures are mature. And if you were to build a nuclear power plant in the Hunter, as I indicated in my opening remarks, one would have to undertake a seismic hazard assessment. It should involve industry and academic experts from the US and elsewhere, including Australia, and one would characterise the effects of earthquake shaking on that particular site and design for it. So, again, routine.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. Ms. Mascarenhas. We can't hear you there, Anita, sorry. All right, we might just go
Still
to
muted.
Ms. Ryan for one quick moment. Ms. Ryan? Dr. Ryan, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both for your testimony this morning. Professor Whitaker, you referenced the Vogel reactor in the US, which I understood was completed more than 7 years later than had been anticipated and took more than 15 years to be completed. But it was your suggestion that we could, in Australia, potentially build a plant like that in less than 10 years. On what basis do you say that, given that we haven't got any experience locally in construction of nuclear power plants of this size and capacity?
So I'd encourage you to look at Professor Buongiorno's slides, and I think he has a slide from memory that talks to Plant Vogel. And Plant Vogel was the first of a kind build of AP1000. The process that was followed to construct that plant was less than optimal in hindsight. The construction commenced with the design less than 50% complete. And that was a pathway that the applicant chose to follow that, in hindsight, was the wrong pathway to follow. So construction began when the design wasn't complete. The design of AP1000 is now complete. And it has been built twice in the United States, and there are numerous countries abroad, mostly in Europe, looking to build the next AP1000 in relatively short periods of time. The APR 1400 reactor that was built in Baraka is a physically bigger reactor than AP1000. And it was built in 8 years, start to finish, Unit 1. And for the 4 units at the Baccarat site, 12 years were needed for that construction. So if AP1000 was to be built in Australia, we would start with a completed design. And you make the point that Australia does not have a mature nuclear industry. But as I indicated in my opening remarks, between 50 and 60% of the construction cost involves constructing a reactor building. And, you know, the Australian construction industry is mature, quite capable of building a large reinforced concrete structure. So it's for those reasons that I believe Australia could build AP1000 in a relatively short period of time, a much shorter period of time than was needed to finish Vogel 3. I will add that Vogel 4, which was built adjacent to Vogel 3, it was finished within 18 months of Vogel 3, and there were significant savings in terms of both time and cost because there was learning from doing. And again, in my opening remarks, I point to the importance of building multiple units on the same site so you can utilise the same construction workforce and ideally the same supply chains. So it's my firm opinion that if we built another AP1000 in the United States from scratch, it would take 5 years, perhaps 5 to 6 years, but much shorter than the time required to build Vogel 3.
Andrew, do you mind if I add a comment?
Please.
So Andrew made a lot of the points I was going to make if I were to answer that question. I'll just add 2 here. First, the AP1000 has been built now in, I think, 6 units in China with time and cost that are significantly lower than what we've seen at Vogel. Now, China, of course, is a different context. Particularly, they are very, very good at building large things efficiently, a capability that we have unfortunately lost in the US and Western Europe, primarily because we haven't built big things, including nuclear reactors, for several decades. But it's not a technology-specific issue. This is more of a set of challenges that the construction sector certainly faces in the United States. Having said that, I know the companies involved in the Vogel project rather well, particularly Westinghouse, which incidentally went belly up because of that project, because of cost overruns in that project. And one thing they've done very seriously and very well, in my opinion, is to capture all the possible lessons learned from the many mistakes they've made in that project. So based on my professional judgment, I think they are ready for the next wave of AP1000 construction projects with much better prepared than they were when they started the projects back in the early 2010s. Over.
Thank you, if I may, Chair. Just in terms of that, we do have a bit of an issue, and I know neither of you are a resident in Australia, but we have an issue with our construction workforce, which is currently contributing to a housing crisis in this country. Without disputing that this would be a boon for those people in that industry were we to start building these sorts of plants in Australia, what sort of workforce are we actually looking at in terms of the size?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I don't know enough about the situation in Australia to comment on specifics, but I can tell you that the number of workers involved in one such project honestly depends on where it is, because there is also a significant difference in labor rates. So in particularly in China, also in South Korea, where labor rates are significantly lower in the United States and Europe, they tend, or even the Emirates, they tend to have a little bit a bigger workforce to work on these projects. Based on our analysis, that's not the key to the success. Is not that they throw more warm bodies, but it certainly is a positive element. But just to give you an idea, it can be as little as 3,000 to as many as 6,000 or 7,000 workers per project. So this would be a large reactor, gigawatt, perhaps multi-units for 10 years. Now, of course, a lot of people choose to view that as a positive. You know, you get to employ and provide well-paid jobs to a lot of people, but it is a challenge, obviously, to recruit such a large workforce to build big plants, which might make more attractive to also look at smaller plants, physically smaller and simpler plants, because obviously they're expected to be a little bit simpler to build and faster.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ryan. Ms. Mascarenhas?
All right, I hope you can hear me now.
Good, very good,
Yes.
Janita. I mean, Ms. Mascarenhas.
Okay, let's see. Okay, great. So this is a question for Professor Buongiorno. You've said in a podcast that you were seeing not many reactors being built outside China, and that was due to a plethora of challenges in the US and Europe around supply chain and fuel and equipment and licensing of new designs, financing, market conditions, and availability of a qualified workforce. Do you want to expand on that a little bit more? And would you see that these challenges would also exist in Australia?
Well, first of all, I'm very flattered that you listen to my podcasts and remember
I'm an engineer as well.
my point so well. Yeah, those comments are correct. Of course, they also depend on which design we're talking about here. So we spent now the past 10 minutes discussing the AP1000. That's a water-cooled reactor that uses fuel that is available now from the global supply chain. It has an established, at this point, global supply chain for components. So many of those challenges don't apply here. The challenge of financing, of course, applies everywhere. Access to relatively low-cost capital is key. These are projects that entail a large initial investment, so there is obviously an effect of the weighted average cost of capital on the final cost of the plant. But in terms of supply chain, the technologies they use fuel components, alloys that are similar to the existing fleet of reactor, those technologies don't have a supply chain issue. If you're looking at what people call advanced reactors, sometimes they're called Generation 4. Again, I'm back to this sort of soup of acronyms and idiomatic expressions and things of that type. There is a challenge there, and it's real. So, for example, in the United States, several advanced reactor vendors have decided that their reactors will use uranium that is higher than 5% enriched, less than 20%, between 5 and 20. That's called HALEU, ISA, low-enriched uranium, that requires enrichment facilities that at the moment we don't have in the United States. The Department of Energy, U.S. government, federal government has made the investment so that material will be available before the end of the decade. And so if Australia decides to go with that particular set of technologies, the fuel will be available, because realistically you're not going to deploy reactors in Australia before the end of the decade, unless you go with microreactors. So again, it really depends on the technologies.
And are you also familiar with Australia's environmental approvals and processes with traditional owners? And when you think about timeframes, do timeframes also include those?
Again, maybe not a good question for me. I don't know if Andrew wants to comment on this, but you're referring to the fuel, as I mentioned in an earlier answer. Australia is already a major player in producing uranium. Australia does not enrich uranium, but that's not needed for Australia to develop domestic enriching capabilities. Enrichment services are available at the international market, including France, the United States, the UK, etc.
Also, with the slides that you provided, you talked about the cost of electricity per megawatt hour. And the thing that I'm wondering with those costs is whether that included maintenance, replacement costs, input fuel, cost of fuel storage.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. When the figures that we refer to there are so-called levelized cost of electricity, so they include the construction of the plant, both front end and back end, which means decommissioning, which typically occurs after 60 or, as Andrew mentioned, even 80 years. That's basically the lifetime, the technical lifetime of the plant. It includes all the mining operation related to the fabrication of the fuel, the cost of the fuel while it's being used within the reactor, the cost of disposal of the fuel, which is within a relatively small range, and then operation and maintenance. So that is the total levelized cost of electricity.
Thank you. And maybe a question for Professor Whitaker. So can you talk through the site selection process for where a nuclear reactor will go and how thorough that process is?
The process is rigorous. You need a client or an applicant who wants to construct a reactor. They would identify a site perhaps based on off-takers of the energy, and then there's a process that's followed in the US, and that's the one I'm most familiar with, that is rigorous. There's a characterisation of hazards. I've talked about the earthquake hazard, but you would have to consider the other natural hazards. So there's a site characterisation effort to be undertaken by typically engineers and some scientists, but again, the processes are mature. What drives the selection of a site is going to be driven by need, and so there's no one strategy for site selection. You're probably not going to place a large light water reactor right in the middle of a major city, and you're probably not going to place it out in the middle of the Northern Territory, because you then need to invest significantly in transmission to get the energy to the end users. So it's probably not up to either me or Jacopo to reflect on which site is best, but rather to say once a site or sites are identified, then you can go through a process to characterise the site, to characterise the hazards, and then make a financial decision on where to locate the facility.
Is there an
Andrew?
international standard that exists? And it sounded like someone else had a question as well. Are there international standards that exist, and would that also take into account the water requirements and the scale that's required for nuclear power stations and the possibility of tsunami risks, etc.?
Final question, Ms. Mascarenas.
Yep, cool.
Andrew, do you mind if I take that? Because I was gonna augment your answer by saying, to the extent that there is a desire to retire coal plants for environmental reasons, sites that currently host coal-fired plants are almost ideal for nuclear power plants, for the simple reasons that you get to reuse a lot of the existing infrastructure at the site. For example, transmission lines already exist. Cooling water, cooling towers, or cooling canals already exist. So, to your point, absolutely, siting takes into account water usage. I will just mention in passing, it is possible to design a nuclear power plant to have dry cooling, to basically use atmospheric air as what we call the ultimate heat sink. There is a cost penalty associated with that and a slight efficiency penalty, but it is possible if a site is direly strained in terms of water access. It's possible not to use water at all. But coal plant sites are really ideal because, like I said, you get to reuse some of the infrastructure. And by the way, you get to also rehire the workforce. It has to be retrained, because a nuclear plant is different from a coal plant, but there are all sorts of good synergies. I won't comment on tsunamis. I don't know if, Andrew, you want to say something about tsunamis. These obviously would be relevant only to coastal sites, and I don't know what the situation is there in Australia.
Let me say the tsunami risk is low.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.
Again, this would be something that would be considered if one was to choose a site, let's say, in northwest Western Australia, where there might be some exposure to a tsunami generated by a major earthquake in the Indonesian archipelago. So it's just a design consideration, not out of the ordinary, just routine.
Thank you. Mr Chester?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Professors, for being available. Just in relation to the previous discussion and for clarity, can I assure the Professors that the coalition plan isn't for a nuclear energy plant in any capital cities or in remote Northern Territory? In fact, quite the opposite. I'd like you to expand on this question around actively reusing coal-fired power station sites as they're retired, which has been a key factor in the coalition's plan, and just reflect on the social licence issues around how we encourage or explain the value in that proposition, but also the workforce issues you touched on. I think, Professor Buongiorno, about retraining workers. I know you've worked in the industry for a long time. What the capacity is to reskill people to work in the industry?
Yeah, but first let me clarify. I work with industry. I've been in academia for all my career and prior to that, national lab. But yes, I do know the nuclear industry. And so to answer your question, an average nuclear power plant, large scale, let's say gigawatts, requires of the order of 300-400 operators as well as security guards, etc., per unit. So you're looking at a 2-unit, easily you're looking at 600-700 people. So I don't know what the workforce looks like for coal plants in Australia. I imagine it might be a little bit smaller than that. So essentially all the workers could be rehired, again, retrained depending on their skill sets, but there will have to be a need for additional hires there. And not all of them need to be nuclear engineers. In fact, the nuclear specific expertise is razor thin. Primarily the folks that work in the control room. Those are licensed operators. When I say licensed, it means licensed by the federal regulator in the United States, and I assume it will be a federal regulator in Australia as well. So that's the job side. In the US, if you look at average salary compensation for nuclear power plants is significantly higher than coal plants. So the example that we now are observing in the US is the Kemmerer site. You might have heard of TerraPower. That's the company that was created by Bill Gates 15 years ago. They finally are building their first reactor in Wyoming at a coal-fired plant site where the coal plant is going out of business. And so they basically rehire the whole workforce. They're hiring more people, they're retraining them. And as I said earlier, the synergies are around transmission lines, cooling infrastructures, access roads, administrative buildings. There is a lot that you can reuse. The other positive aspect, if you look at the peak of support for nuclear in the US is typically in counties and towns where there are nuclear plants, and primarily it's a comfort factor. I think people have been there for a long time, and they develop a level of comfort with the technology. Their neighbor or themselves might be workers at the site, so there is a level of trust that things are done safely and reliable. But the other benefit that I was going to mention is, of course, also tax revenue. These are plants, these are big industrial facilities, not because they're nuclear, but they're big industrial facilities. They pay a lot of tax revenue, so they're usually welcome in the local communities. Andrew, do you want to add?
Just let me add and it's a personal perspective, here in the state of New York, just south of Buffalo, a coal plant closed 7 or 8 years ago. It was about 800 megawatts or thereabouts. And when it closed, the tax base for the town and the community dropped 40%. And in the United States, that tax base pays for hospitals, police, schools, and similar. The poverty rate ticked up 10 percentage points, and the median household income dropped by $10,000, and it wasn't particularly high to start. So the closing of these fossil assets has a huge impact on communities in rural areas, and certainly the administration here has recognised the importance of being just with this energy transition. So the opportunity to repower coal plants with nuclear heat sources, I think, shouldn't be undervalued. You're able to replace a heat source and, as Jacopo said, retains some fraction of the balance of plant, and the distribution systems, transmission systems, the switch yards and so on, and to the point of retraining workers, recognise that, yes, folk do work inside the coal plant, but there are also engineers and technicians and the like that support the transmission of that power to customers. They support work in the switch yards. And so there are, as Jacopo said, significant synergies between coal and nuclear, and it's an opportunity that Australia should pay close attention to.
Thanks, gentlemen.
We are certainly paying close attention to it here in the United States.
Thanks, gentlemen. And as a member who represents Latrobe Valley, the conversation with my community is quite well advanced. It's quite an energy literate community. The hesitancy amongst, some residents around the twin issues of safety and cost. And Professor Whitaker, you referred to the site characterisation studies and issues around seismic activity could be covered off under business as usual around safety issues. So I appreciate you clarifying that. In the question of cost, I think you said, Professor Whitaker, that it's not cheap to build, but they do provide firm energy for up to 80 years. And Professor Buongiorno, you said something along the lines of including a little bit of nuclear in the mix, it drastically reduces the average cost to the consumer. Can you just expand on that? Because it is a little bit hard for people to understand how this concept of overbuilding renewables, the embedded cost in that, the cost to food producing land and that type of thing. So how in your, in this question about socialising, how would you explain to people that you're going to reduce the average cost by having some nuclear and some renewables rather than a 100% weather dependent system of energy generation in Australia?
Yeah, great question. Let me try. So once again, solar and wind, their cost has come down. Great technologies. The Achilles heels of renewables is the intermittency. So we all know the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. That means you don't get the energy when you need it. Not necessarily you get it when you need it. So if you need to meet demand, and there is a variability in demand, and you're trying to basically meet that demand with zero emissions, and you're excluding something that looks like nuclear, which is carbon-free and base load, you're left with solar, wind. But solar and wind alone are not enough. You need energy storage, because essentially you need to store the energy when it's not needed and then supply it when it's needed. Now, there are two time scales here. One is sort of the daily time scale. At night, for example, solar, for obvious reasons, doesn't produce, but you still have a certain demand at night that must be met. And then there is a seasonal time scale. We tend to produce with solar, you tend to produce more energy during the summer, but you still need to provide energy in the fall, in the spring, and during the winter. So you need a lot of energy storage that allows you to basically store the energy when it's generated and then deliver it when it's needed. If you look at the aggregate cost of all that energy storage and the overcapacity of solar and wind that you need to deploy, because they have a low capacity factor, a low utilization factor. For solar is of the order of 20, 30%. For wind, maybe a little bit higher, but not even close to 50%. The aggregate cost of all that equipment, plus all the transmission line that goes with it to move the electrons from where they're generated to where they're used, that aggregate cost is much, much higher than the aggregate cost of a grid that has, yes, solar and wind, yes, a little bit of storage, but also a nice, solid, stable, carbon-free generation from something that looks like nuclear. And when I say something that looks like nuclear, it means either nuclear, or it could be hydro if you have plenty of hydro. I think Australia, probably like every other country in the world, has maxed out on hydro. It could even be fossil fuels if you can do carbon capture and sequestration. So it boils down to what's available, what the cost of these alternative, reliable baseload energy sources are. And so when you look at that decarbonized and reliable energy mix, it turns out, based on our modeling, at this point, a lot of other groups and a lot of other organizations have done similar modeling, that having a little bit of nuclear in there, as I said in my introductory remarks, I'd say between 15 and 30%, 20 to 30%, is actually very valuable and does reduce the aggregate cost of the grid.
Final question, Mr. Chester.
Thank you, gentlemen. And this is a quick one, I think. One thing about the inquiry which has surprised me is that it's not such an immature industry in Australia as I suspected. These are my own assessments. If I was to describe Australia's nuclear industry, I'd say it was small but highly capable. and with some high level of regulatory environment already. How would you describe our starting position in terms of if we're going down this pathway towards civilian nuclear energy? Are we more advanced or further down the pathway than perhaps most Australians would understand?
You want me to take that one? Let me take that one, Jacopo. So again, I go back to building a nuclear power plant and 50 to 60% of the cost being spent in the Australian construction industry. The building envelope, or the building that supports a nuclear reactor, is just that, a building. Nothing more, nothing less. And Australia knows how to construct buildings. I worked in the late 1970s and early 1980s in Melbourne, the Victorian Arts Centre is one example. We knew how to construct that building. Australians know how to design and construct buildings. So 50 to 60% of the cost of the asset, Australia can do it very well already. Then there are the mechanical systems, and then there are the specialty nuclear systems. Australia won't have a lot of capacity in terms of designing specialty nuclear equipment, but as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that's probably 15% of the cost of the asset. And there are mechanical systems like power piping and the like that could be fabricated in Australia. So I think we look at nuclear as boutique, and as an energy source, as Jacopo said, it's really efficient. And Australia doesn't have as much experience with nuclear as, say, the United States or Great Britain. But in terms of constructing 80% of the nuclear power plant, Australia would be very, very good if it was just described as a building and some mechanical systems. So I think I know the Australian construction industry is mature. Australia has tremendous engineers and some excellent contractors. So building a nuclear power plant, in my mind, requires diligence. It will require the country to stand up add capacity to the regulator, to be sure, but Australians can get it done. About that, I have no doubt.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chester. Mr. Perrott, we'll go to you quickly and then I'll finish off. You're a bit sweaty there, Mr. Perrott.
Have a run, Mr. Perrott.
Sorry, I've been out walking the dog.
He spilled his coffee.
It's a little bit earlier here in Queensland. Thank you for your evidence, Professor Buongiorno and Professor Whitaker. I just want to get your understanding of the technology when it comes to water. We've just inspected 2 sites in Queensland that the Deputy Chair's party has proposed as sites for a nuclear reactor. Both sites have experienced 10 to 11 drought declarations in the last 60 years. And I was wondering if you could talk me through the water use and how that goes. These are inland sites, I should say, the 2 that we've inspected recently. And if I maybe go to you, Mr. Buongiorno first, Professor Buongiorno.
Yeah. Let me explain simply. So, in many ways, no different than a coal-fired plant or a natural gas plant, right? So, all power plants that rely on a heat source, either the combustion of coal or natural gas or the fission of uranium, which would be a nuclear plant, need to basically discharge what we call waste heat or residual heat to the environment. And that can be done either in a dry manner or in a wet manner. If it's a dry manner, you're using air from the atmosphere to reject that heat. As I said earlier, that entails a little bit higher capital cost because the component that we call the condenser, that condenses the steam within the plant, in the case of air-cooled, needs to be equipped with large fans that push that air over the condenser. And so there is a higher capital cost, and there is also a little bit of an efficiency cost, an efficiency penalty, because those fans consume a little bit of energy. If you do it wet, you need to be close to a body of water, whether it's a river or an artificial reservoir or the ocean. And so the amount of water required really depends on the size of the reactor or the size of the power plant. Again, not a difference there between nuclear and coal, roughly speaking. Of course, the individual design might make a little bit of a difference. And then within the wet cooling approach. There are two sub-approaches, if you allow me the expression. One would be cooling towers. So those are the hulky, big, hyperbolic cooling towers. They are fairly iconic for coal-fired and nuclear plant. Those actually tend to consume less water because they basically use the latent heat of evaporation. So they literally evaporate off a little bit of water. That's how the heat is released. Or you have once-through cooling. In that case, literally you got water coming in from the river or the ocean or that artificial reservoir through the condenser, becoming a little bit warmer, and then be returned to that body of water at a little bit higher temperature. There are, of course, very strict rules on how hot you can return that water because you don't want to harm fauna and flora, the ecosystem, the local ecosystem. I hope that answered.
It does, and it sounds like water is a crucial part and can determine the size of the nuclear reactor if the water supply is constrained.
Correct.
Mr. Whitaker, anything to add?
Not really. I think, again, this just is part of the site characterisation, understanding what's available and what's not. And if droughts were common, then that's something that would have to be factored into the decision making. But again, not out of the ordinary. Again, somewhat routine.
And you can go with dry cooling if you have a drought.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So it can be designed around.
You're just on mute there, Mr. Perrott. And still.
One more time. Sorry, does dry cooling work in hot places like the UAE and central Queensland, which is pretty close to the Tropic of Capricorn?
Yes, it would. In the UAE, however, it's a coastal site and they're using water from the Delta. They didn't go dry cool. It is also a massive plant. It's a 5,600 megawatts electric, 4 large reactors. I doubt we're considering this for these sites in Australia. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
Thank you, Mr. Perrott. I've just got a couple of final questions to ask at the end here. Mr. Whitaker, you say the site characterisation. How long does that usually take to do?
It depends what information you start with. If I know seismic site characterisation best, assuming some knowledge of geologic conditions which would be available if other infrastructure was built in the region. We're talking for seismic 12 to 18 months. If you have to drill to characterise site geology, perhaps add another 6 months, but in the range of, let's say, 1 to 2 years.
No worries.
And the other important point to note here is that often there is preliminary information available that would allow a design to proceed with appropriate conservatism. So you can undertake a seismic hazard characterisation, for example, starting with information that might be generated by the US Geological Survey, and you'd know you'd be close to the final answer. And then your site-specific study might change the numbers by 10, 15%, but that would then be easily accommodated in the design. So these tasks do not have to happen in sequence. Some can run in parallel.
And Andrew, would it be fair to say that this is an additional advantage of considering construction of a nuclear plant at a coal-fired plant site because there is already considerable amount of information about the environmental impact of a big industrial facilities at that site?
You are correct. And indeed, that has driven some decision-making in terms of repowering coal plants or coal with nuclear, because all of that data are available and dating back to when the coal plant was constructed.
Thank you. And so my next question is around timelines as well. We're going to go to an election next year, so 2025, at best, because every single state and territory has a ban on nuclear in this country, including us as a federal government. So let's say at best it takes 5 years to get that sorted, and they all come on board and say yes. So it's 2030, and then it's 8 to 12 years construction time, plus a 2.5 year consultation period, plus site characteristics time as well of 2 years there. That pushes that out to around 2045. To be able to, could you please let me finish, Deputy Chair?
To be clear,
Deputy Chair, I didn't interrupt you for any of yours.
To be clear,
so
Chair, can you please clarify for the witnesses?
Please, Deputy Chair.
That this is your view and not the Coalition's policy.
I'm not. I didn't say your policy or plan whatsoever,
Thank
Deputy
you.
Chair.
Thank
so
you.
I'm just saying from timelines that I can quickly work out. And
Thank you
with
for
my
clarifying that,
simple
Chair.
maths that I can do.
Thank you, Chair.
So yeah, back to the witnesses, please. What do we do? So, for instance, the Bays Liddell Power Station, where it has been put by the Deputy Chair and his team to say that that's where one of the nuclear sites are proposed to be. The workforce there has already finished. They're starting to pull that down. Bayswater, which is across the road, that finishes up in 2032, maybe 2033 is when AGL is finishing up with that site. What happens to the workforce? Because you said the workforce can just transfer over. What happens to the workforce for that 10-year period in between? Or maybe if we even go less, 8-year period, if you want to go at a very shorter time frame.
So maybe let me start. Again, I won't comment on the workforce because I don't know the specifics of the site, but some of the activities you mentioned in your question can be parallelized. You may have a ban. I suppose that's a very important initial legal step that you need to take care of. But there is no reason why initial characterization of the site, techno-economic analysis of the value of the plant, as well as engagement with partner countries, supply chain technologies, and even beefing up the regulator, which honestly has to happen because of AUKUS anyway. There is no reason why all those activities should not start sooner than the legal ban. As for the actual timeline, the timeline of actually constructing the plant, the advanced technologies, setting the AP1000 aside, which has been built at this point in 2 countries, it will be built more, et cetera, which is available and is ready now. For the advanced reactor, like small modular reactors and non-water cool reactors, the demonstration projects that are taking place now in the US and in Canada are all expected to be completed by 2030. Now, since I've seen this sort of film unfold in prior, I can tell you maybe it will be 2032. Okay, there'll be maybe some schedule slip because they are first of a kind projects. But I'm pretty confident that by mid-2030s, these technologies will be available and commercially available. So again, you can order a plant prior to that and be ready, I think, comfortably by mid-2035s or late 2030s.
No worries.
That's my assessment.
No worries, thank you. And that, so as you said, where we have the ban on this is one of the hardest things legislation-wise. We've heard from experts that that'll take 8 to 10 years just to get that bit sorted if we start today. From the experience that she's had in the past with other things we've tried to do.
I assume you don't want us to comment on this because that's
no, it's okay.
Really
it was more of a comment. Yes, it was more of a comment. Mr. Whitaker, so I live in the Hunter, right, and I'm the member for Hunter. We have had a lot of seismic activity and people are genuinely concerned around having a nuclear power station in our region with the seismic activity we've had. What can you do to reassure them without having a look at that site that it will be okay to have a nuclear power station there?
That's easy. So the seismicity in the Hunter Valley is low. And that we talk about this in terms of intensity of earthquake shaking. It's low. There's a lot of chatter in the press, most of it wrong. The shaking hazard is low. We build nuclear power plants in regions of high seismic hazard. Diablo Canyon was built in coastal California in the 1980s and it's operated very successfully since then. reactors have been constructed in Japan, and those reactors have survived significant earthquake shaking. Now, what happened at Fukushima was related to the tsunami, not the earthquake shaking. The earthquake shaking led to the scram of those reactors, and that scram was very successful. So can we design reactors to resist the effects of earthquake shaking? Absolutely. Seismic hazard in the Hunter is low, just like central and eastern United States, but we characterise the hazard in the central and eastern United States, and I would expect someone to characterise the seismic hazard properly in the Hunter Valley if a decision was to be made to build a nuclear plant. Can it be built? Absolutely.
No worries, thank you, Mr. Whitaker. And as you said, anything can be built. We have great engineers all around Australia and the world, so things can be done. But the social licence with getting that through the community that I'm part of right now is definitely going to be a challenge for the coalition at some stage if they do get to this. Thank you very much for your time today, guys. Would you like your slides you gave us put in as evidence to this, as submissions to the inquiry?
Yes, please.
Yep, no worries, thank you. We'll just have to have a private meeting on that to do that, but that's okay.
And you are welcome to use mine too. I sent an update. I found a few typos in the slide deck that I sent yesterday, so I sent an updated deck this morning my time, so I would be grateful if you would include the revised deck in anything that goes into the record.
No worries. Thank you, Mr. Whitaker, and thank you, Mr. Buongiorno, for your time today. It's been great having you. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, including questions on notice, please forward it to the Secretariat by Friday the 6th of December 2024. Please note that responses to questions on notice will be published on the website as submissions to the inquiry. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript for your evidence, of your evidence to assist you with answering questions taken on notice today, and you'll have the opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. I would like to thank the witnesses, the committee members, broadcasting and the secretariats for all the hard work they've put in this morning. Thank you very much for appearing.
Thank you, professors, very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Have a great day.
Yeah, goodbye.
Bye-bye.
That's great, thank you. Cheers, guys.